Nothing contained in this podcast should be considered a substitute for professional medical advice. This content does not represent our respective employers and is purely the opinion of the podcast hosts. We are not your personal medical providers. Sorry, friends. So, if you have any questions or concerns or seeking advice, diagnosis, and or treatment, please seek individual, personalized advice from a healthcare provider in your area. We are not liable for any risks or issues associated with using or acting upon the information contained in this podcast. This is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only, so enjoy the ride. Welcome to Medical Media Mixer, the perfect cocktail. I'm Nicole Peniston, licensed psychologist.
And I'm Tara Prisco, physician assistant.
So how are you feeling today?
Recovering from death, The flu is sucky.
It is.
Go back to episode 1, listeners, if you have not listened about the flu. 0 out of 5 do not recommend, whatever they say.
0 stars, do not recommend.
Yeah, I had my flu shot, but I actually don't make great antibodies because I'm on immunosuppressants, so I don't think it worked very well for me.
Yeah.
But I'm on, let's see, it started Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so I'm day 5, 6-ish.
Okay.
Yeah.
My deepest condolences, but I'm super happy that I didn't catch it from you because we got to hang out in person twice last week.
I know. And I was like, oh God, please don't let me get Nicole
and somehow
sick.
I dodged the bullets. Tara was only praying that I didn't get it because I had just had surgery the week before. But
yeah, you didn't need that.
I dodged the bullet, luckily. And it's funny. I think I've only actually had the flu once in my life. And then I'm not even 100% sure it was the flu. So for some reason,
if you feel like you've been hit by a truck and you haven't, it is the flu.
Yeah, I had that happen once, like right when COVID was starting, and I assumed it was COVID, but then I had to get tested for antibodies for work, and I didn't have any antibodies, so I'm like, well, it wasn't COVID, so maybe that was the flu?
Maybe.
But even that only lasted like a day.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. What else is going on for you? Hopefully just resting.
Yeah, like I said, I went back to work. So, my staff is taking it easy on me and letting me get back into it. Oh, you know what I wanted to bring up on the pod since we talked about it a lot? We did, one of the things we saw each other was career day.
Yeah.
And you particularly were talking a lot about what got you into psychology. So maybe we share with the listeners, like, what inspired you.
You want me to share?
Yeah, you can share first. I'll share second.
Like you're talking to someone else. It's just the two of us. Sorry.
No, it's this person over here.
No, honestly, like when you said it, I was like, oh, that would be great if our listeners told us what inspired them to listen to our podcast. But no.
No, like you were telling the students, like what made you want to get into psychology?
So I was always interested somewhat in psychology. And then psychology was an elective for us in high school. And so I took that. And we had this amazing teacher, Miss Lusich at the time, now Miss Lynch. Shout out to her if she listens.
She's amazing.
Yeah. And there was one particular class where she taught us about Harry Harlow, where if you guys are psych heads, you know he's a big name in the field, and the experiments he did with baby monkeys. And that was kind of like a nature versus nurture comforting attachment theory experiments where these baby monkeys were set with wire mothers. So they were just wire looking places, wires with essentially had like a fake monkey head on it. So the babies thought it was their mommy. And one was like warm and had like towels on it and comforting. And the other only had food. And the baby monkeys always went to the one that was more comforting versus the one that offered food. And so much so that they had to end the experiment because some of the baby monkeys were starving to death. So after learning about that in class, I was like, what in the world? I need to learn all about all this. And it was not a linear road from there to becoming a psychologist, but it definitely was one of my big early influences, and it always sticks with me.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. I like that. I mean, I took that class. I do not remember that experiment particularly, but I do remember that being such a fun class. So this just brought it all to life. Yeah. She really did.
And she still does, apparently. The students told us that last week.
So I know. She still teaches that same lesson. They had it recently. So that's pretty amazing.
And Mr. Scrack was like, wait, so you're telling me she hasn't updated her lesson plan in 20 years? And we're like, be quiet.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. These are the classics of psychology.
So my story of medicine is a little different. So since I was very, very, very little, like 4 or 5 years old, I knew I wanted to go into medicine, probably heavily inspired by the fact that my sister had cancer as a baby. And so I saw how, now, spoiler alert, she is grown and healthy and amazing and also works in medicine.
And maybe she'll be on the show one day.
Right? Yeah, if we get something in her specialty, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it just seeing the kind of amazing things that medicine could do for somebody in that kind of a position points me in that direction. And so I always loved science. Growing up, I was always raising my hand in science class, little kiss up nerd. And in college, I majored in biology with the intention of going to medical school, but I really had a really bad advisor who did not help me at all, gave me no direction. And so all of my bio major classes were shared with these people who are in these 3+3 programs for a physician assistant, physical therapist, I think athletic trainer, and maybe the speech language pathology people were also in those classes. And they really encouraged me to speak to their advisor, Dr. Rosigno, who apparently is still at Seton Hall as well, doing the 3+3 program. And he was absolutely amazing. He's one of those people, just like Miss Lucich, who just kind of touches your life. And he told me all about what a PA was, because you remember the late 90s, early 2000s, it wasn't a huge thing, especially in New Jersey. I never, as a kid, saw a PA, as a patient. And so it was something that once he explained it to me, he helped me to actually kind of backdoor get in the 3+3 program so I didn't have to apply outside the school, which means that I went straight from undergrad into grad school without having to apply or take my GREs. Nice. And I was the youngest person in my class to graduate at age 24.
Awesome. Good for you. I didn't know what I wanted to be until I was like 30. And even then I wasn't 100% sure, but it's where I'm at now. So,
hey, it works.
Yeah. And before we get started, I had to tell you, I told you before we started recording, I want to tell you a shopping story.
Okay.
I'm obsessed with Dolly Parton. We've talked about Dolly on the cast before.
Yes.
Hopefully she listens. I feel like in my heart she would, and she supports us because Dolly supports everyone. But Dolly is doing a collab with another one of my favorites, Khloe Kardashian.
Okay.
For jeans called Jolene's jeans.
Ooh.
And so I ordered them today. And they were really expensive, and I hope they're worth it. But I've thought about it, like jeans are kind of one of those things, like once you find a pair you love, like you wear them to death.
Yes.
Like they're a closet staple. So I
if
told
you
my
fall
mom
in
about
love
it.
with it, yeah.
Yeah, I was waiting for my mom to be like, oh my God, how could you spend that much money on jeans? And she was like, well, if you like them. And I was like, yes, that's the energy I need here.
Go, Mom.
Well, she loves Dolly too. So
have you been singing Jolene?
I have not. So I just ordered them today. They were just released today. I ordered them right away because I knew they were going to sell out. So when I get them, maybe I'll sing Jolene while wearing them.
So when I go on vacation soon to Tennessee, actually, one of the things we're going to do, well, Dollywood is there. I'm not sure if we're going to go or not. That's going to depend on like sort of our itinerary, what we kind of get done. Mm-hmm. But we are doing her sort of dinner show stampede thing, which is like sort of like medieval times, except for cowboys. Awesome. And so it's like North versus South, and everybody cheers it on. And there's this whole show with the horses and stuff. So that'll be fun. Cool. And that's run by Dolly.
Yeah. She's amazing. She's a treasure. So should we get into our topics for today?
We got some, and we actually sort of coordinate with our topics today.
Yeah, a little bit. So I'll start off with my drink. My drink is called the Nonbinary Basil. It's supposed to be purple. You can't really see it. It was purple when I first made it in the shaker, but it's starting to settle. So now it's just kind of lilac. But I got this recipe from an article on SGN, the Seattle Pacific Northwest LGBTQIA news and entertainment source since 1974. And so they had released an article a couple years ago about cocktails for Pride Month. And so this was one of the cocktails listed on there. So the non-binary basil, it includes, I have to scroll down because there's a lot of cocktails they listed. The quote they have is, I don't like gin, but I like this. And so I feel like that's pretty consistent if you guys don't like gin. So it's 1.5 ounces of gin, the juice of 2 limes, 1 tablespoon of blackberry jam, 3 to 4 basil leaves, and a dash of aromatic bitters. I definitely added too much bitters because I shook it and then nothing came out. So I shook it again and then a lot came out. But it's okay. So you just combine all of those ingredients in a cocktail shaker with ice, shake for 20 to 30 seconds or until the shaker becomes icy, strain into a glass with ice and garnish with basil leaves or a lime wedge. Cheers. So that's what I'm drinking today. It's tastes strong, but I think it's not necessarily alcohol strong. I think it's the bitterness from the bitters and then the limes, like the tartness from the limes. I think that's what it is.
Nice. But I like the jam or whatever in there.
Yeah, I thought that was a cool addition. I'm going to talk about 2 things today that are interconnected in science, in history, but they are 2 separate concepts. So I'm going to talk about the concept of being intersex, but I'm also going to talk about the concept of sexual gender assignment surgery in infancy. So, which is a very, very specific thing. It's not the same as gender assignment surgery later on when someone's transitioning. This is typically for a medical reason why you would do it in infancy. So there's a very famous case back from the 60s, mid to late 60s, about, at the time, he was referred to as the John Joan case, which Miss Lisage was also talking about in her psychology class. I don't remember that as vividly. I know it did come up then, but apparently she taught it last week to some of those students because they talked about it. So I thought this was very timely for that. I'd already planned to do this case before I learned that, though. So back in the early 60s, there was a man named David Reimer. He was born Bruce Peter Reimer. So that's important because there are some name changes along the way. But he was a male at birth, and he had to be raised, or he didn't have to. He was raised as a girl. They chose to, after following medical advice and intervention when his penis was severely injured during a botched circumcision as an infant. So they didn't intend to raise him as a girl. That wasn't the plan going ahead, but his genitalia was so severely damaged that the doctors just said, we can't repair it. It's just better to just raise him as a girl, just kind of fix what we can and move forward and not discuss that.
Okay.
Which I'm sure we can already think of all the problems of that now in 2025. But, retrospect is 2020. Sorry, hindsight is 2020. So back then in the 1960s, this had never really happened before, at least not that was widely known. And so these doctors and the family were just kind of going with like, okay, well, we don't know what to do, so let's just figure it out. So I'll give you a little bit more information about David first, and then we'll talk about the surgery, what happened with his life. And then I'll talk about other times where we would do a gender assignment surgery in infancy, and that's typically on children who are intersex. So 2 different issues, same surgery. Mm-hmm. So David was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Canada. He was the elder, which I didn't realize this when I was first picking the story. He was the elder of twin boys. So he was an identical twin. So that makes things even more complicated, which I would love to go down the rabbit hole in a future episode just about twin psychology because it's so interesting.
That's a whole nother thing.
All those cool things.
So exciting.
Yeah, I've been very, very lucky to work with several sets of twins in my career. So just really cool stuff.
Fun fact, we graduated a very small high school class, but with 2 sets of identical twins in our class.
In our class alone.
Boy set and a girl set out of 196 kids.
Yep, 2 sets of twins. So his identical twin was named Brian. So it was David and Brian. I'm sorry, it was Bruce and Brian at birth. He changed his name later to David. Their parents were Mennonites, so I think this is important to keep into the context as well, where certain religions have limitations on types of surgeries, medications, things like that they do for religious reasons. So just kind of keeping this in context. They had their child at the age of 6 months. There was a concern about how both of the twin boys urinated, and they were diagnosed with, I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, phimosis?
Phimosis.
Yep. So it's basically when the foreskin is kind of getting in the way of appropriate urination, it can cause problems.
So phimosis, it gets stuck up, can't retract. Paraphimosis is the opposite, where it gets stuck back and can't cover.
Yeah. And so they chose circumcision for that medical reason. It wasn't something that in their community they would have naturally gone to, as a lot of families now kind of consider either or early on. This was done for medical reasons on both of the children. And so they were referred for circumcision at 7 months. And sorry, I just have to, because we know what's coming, and I've already alluded to it, but the general practitioner who performed the operation, which I don't know, these days, is it still a GP that would do a circumcision? I know a lot of times they're done in the hospital.
Now it's usually done in the hospital by the OBGYN, actually, who delivered the baby, because they are technically surgeons. So they do it in the baby nursery.
Yeah, but I know that's not always the case, and there's still, circumcision can still be a religious rite, so it's not always done in the hospital, but more often than not now it is.
Yeah,
it would could be safe.
It would be a urologist here, like say now, if you took a kid back later at an older age, a urologist would do it.
Yeah. And so this particular doctor used the unconventional method, apparently it's unconventional, of electrocauterization. So do you want to speak to what that is?
So essentially it's using heat to cut and to coagulate an area. So you can picture sort of a very hot tip. It's very hard to do this without making pictures with my hands,
It's
which
okay.
the people can't see. But basically a very, very hot metal tip that would be used to cut, and then also like it immediately coagulates, stops the bleeding.
So I guess in theory, it could be something that would be done quickly with that method.
Mm-hmm.
But I would still imagine that there's risk just because, like, as
Yes.
little infants, babies, they squirm around if they move too much
And
or.
their parts are so tiny.
Yeah, yeah. So David was the first to have the procedure, and the procedure burned his penis beyond surgical repair.
Oh my
So
goodness.
for him, this was not an option to have it repaired and still be functional. And then because of that, the doctors chose not to operate on the twin.
Okay.
So his identical twin brother was completely spared all of
Right.
this. And so the ironic part of all this is his phimosis resolved on its own. So it was like, oh, maybe Bruce didn't necessarily need this surgery. But again, parents are just following doctor's advice. If they say to do it, you do it. I'm trying not to fault anyone here.
No.
I mean, I don't know how I would feel about this particular doctor, but it's not like he went in and was like, I'm going to burn this baby's penis off. That's not what happened here. There wasn't any, malice in any of this. So the parents were really concerned about Bruce, and so they took him to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore in early 1967, where they met with John Money, who was a psychologist who was a pioneer in the field of sexual development and gender identity at that time, and he worked primarily with intersex patients. So he was probably working on more coming into your own about what your gender is, what that means for your identity. He definitely was a proponent of gender neutrality. So saying that, we learn gender from our social environments versus from anything that's innate. So that you can also see how that may influence some of the decisions that are made later. Right. I will say though, back in the 60s, for these parents at such a young age to be like, let's consult with a psychologist and see how he's going to do his best. That's pretty forward thinking for them.
It is actually.
Yeah. And then they had actually found him because he was interviewed on a Canadian news program talking about his theories about gender development or gender and development. So at that time, he had surgical construction of a vagina. Wait, so no, I read that wrong. Yes. So surgical construction of a vagina was more advanced than construction of a penis in the 60s. So they felt like that would be the easiest for him. They couldn't repair his penis completely. So if they could then create a vagina for him, their assumption was that he would live as a woman with functioning genitalia and adjust. We also have to keep in mind, this happened in 1967. So at this point, Bruce is 2 years old. So it's not like he's a baby, has no clue what's going on. This has been, and they don't really talk too much about what was happening with him physically in those 2 years, as far as, after the surgery, was he having other problems urinating or other issues? Was it painful? There's not too much discussion about that there. Which, we don't necessarily need to go all into it because it's his privacy. But, I wonder about if that also influenced the parents' decision. If he was in pain all the time or if he was really struggling, they thought, okay, doing this might help him.
Right.
So it was Dr. Money and the Johns Hopkins team that persuaded the parents to have the sexual reassignment surgery. They were thinking about it. They were on the fence, but they really, really pushed it. So at the age of 22 months, so just shy of 2, he underwent a bilateral orchiectomy. I was like, orchidectomy? There's no D. Which the testes are surgically removed, and a rudimentary vulva was constructed with plastic surgery, and then he was reassigned to be raised as female and given the name Brenda. So they thought, this is close to Bruce, so that might be an easier transition as well. He was given psychological support for the reassignment and the surgery, and was followed annually for consultations to assess outcome, follow how he was doing, and things like that. And so this particular gender reassignment was considered an important test case for the social learning concept of gender identity. One, because he had an identical twin, so that's the ideal control subject.
Right.
And then 2, trying to think of how to word this well, he had no genetic sexual problems. It wasn't like he was intersex or there were 2 types of an imbalanced hormones. So this was a true complete reassignment, which had not necessarily been done before because a lot of this other work was done on children who are intersex, which I'll get into in a minute. So then this case was then named the John Joan case to protect Brenda Bruce's anonymity. And they did a lot of talks and a lot of studies about how Brenda was progressing. But at the age of 14, Brenda then went to his father and said that he always felt like a boy, even though he knew even though she knew at the time she was a girl. And so that was when the parents kind of shut down the studies and the case and were like, look, like, you did your part, but he's not comfortable. She's not comfortable with this. Let's just stop all of this experimentation. We want our child to be happy. So, according to a biography that was published back in 2001 about this particular case, and specifically about Bruce, Brenda, David, they're all the same person. There was childhood sexual rehearsal play. So it was basically he was encouraged to play at thrusting and copulation movements, basically enacting male sexual roles in play as a child to help him. I'm not really sure why that was. So, but they said that it was a key gender development in primates. And so they were hoping that that would help the transition. And so starting at the age, this is heartbreaking. I apologize to listeners, trigger warning. Starting at the age of 6, the twins were forced to act out sexual acts with Bruce, Brenda, David playing the female role. And so to kind of come to terms, those are air quotes for those who can't see, to a female role. A lot of rape culture stuff going on here, lots of cringy things that now would not fly. But again, for context, this was back in the late 60s, early 70s. And it goes into a lot of detail about that. I'm not going to go into that. But basically, these children were encouraged to act this to basically come into their assigned gender roles, and photographs were taken of these children.
I don't know. I just feel
like... They said
like
it was for the name of science. I'm cringing about it. I don't know what the point of the photographs is. You could have just described it.
But in general, like, what would I tell children of my own to go reinforce their gender roles at that age? Like, at that age, you're just a kid.
I think part of this was coming from the concern that Bruce, Brenda was going to have some confusion. And so wanting to make it explicitly clear by not just doing these acts themselves, but then also with their twin as a model of this is how a boy acts, this is how a girl acts. And I guess they assumed doing it, to children is more appropriate than them watching adults. I don't.
Sexualizing is so weird at that age to begin with.
Well, I will say at the age of 6, that is developmentally when children are more exploratory of their own genitalia, curious about other children and the differences, but not in a sexual way. More of like, right. I got these pieces. What do you got?
Right. I don't know. It's, yeah.
So apparently when the children didn't want to do that, he'd get really yelly. He'd yell at them, get really ill-tempered, and kind of not necessarily force them, but make them feel badly if they didn't do these acts.
This is the doctor.
The doctor, yes. And so his rationale was that this sort of play was important for healthy adult gender identity, and that was based on studies with primates. So it's not like he made this stuff up in his head, but still,
yeah,
some of these things are not transferable. And so at this point now, both twins were emotionally traumatized by all of this stuff. Like I'm thinking about the brother too, is like, he may not fully understand why he has to do this, unless they said like, oh, your sister's sick, or like, and then this child, he was 2 when his brother turned into his sister. Like, was any counseling done with him or explanation about any of that? And so it's not really clear. Some of this stuff doesn't necessarily come out, but just to keep everything in context of how difficult this was for both children, not just for Bruce, Brenda. And so during adolescence, they started to provide estrogen to encourage that sort of development. And so Brenda did develop breasts as a teenager. So let's see. There's some quotes from the doctor that I'm not going to read, just because I feel like he was just really focused on the outcome he was hoping for and kind of missing context, missing problems that could have been occurring. So they attended regular school. Bruce attended a vocational school, and then ended schooling around, it doesn't say exactly, but at 14 started vocational school. So at some point after that, ended public schooling and was tutored privately. But by the age of 13, Brenda was expressing suicidal depression and basically said, if you make me go see that doctor again, that's it, I'm killing myself. So that was when, so I should clarify, when I said before that the parents they stopped doing all these public talks and stuff about it, but he was still involved in being followed by this doctor after that. And then so finally by 1980, at the age of 14, they decided to explain everything fully to Bruce, who probably only knew bits and pieces of the story. And at that point, that was when Bruce/Brenda changed their name to David. And so that's how I'll be referring to him moving forward. So he underwent treatment for reassignment to go back to his original birth gender, including a double mastectomy, a phalloplasty, testosterone injections, a lot of stuff to go back to what originally was going on for him. And that was on the advice of a different psychiatrist and an endocrinologist that, look, if things
Right.
are this way, let's try this. Let's
Yeah.
try to get David back to the best functioning person he can be, whether that's a male or a female. And so for this choice, it was to be a male. And then into adulthood. So he never graduated high school. He had some odd jobs. He worked in a slaughterhouse, which feels kind of triggering and concerning given everything that he'd been in. But you know what? Some people enjoy that job. And then he did marry and adopted that woman's children. But the case came to attention. I don't know if you remember this, but I remember this in 1997 when he told his story to an academic sexologist who kind of wanted to give like the outcome. Like, everybody knows about this Joe and John case. What happened to him? You know, where are they now? And so he came public, and there was an article in Rolling Stone. There was some other articles. He was on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and then he published a biography called As Nature Made Him, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl. And I did read that book. That was published in 2000. And then, so in the book, what is interesting is that even though Dr. Money kept saying that, oh, Brenda's identifying as a girl, everything's going so well, David said, no, I never really identified as a girl. Like, yeah, they dressed me up as a girl and they expected this, but I always knew I was a boy and I always acted like a boy. He underwent a lot of bullying, social isolation, and he felt like it didn't matter how many hormones or how many dresses or Barbie dolls he had, it wasn't working. He was a boy. And so that definitely led to some difficult relationships with his parents. And then, unfortunately, in 2002, he did take his own life via an overdose. And so, oh wait, I'm sorry. So I know that he did take his own life, but the taking his own life by overdose, that was actually his twin brother, was in 2002. So after that, things were really not going well for him. I'm sure there was a lot of guilt and upset about losing your twin. His wife wanted a divorce after that. And then he took his own life 2 years later in 2004 at the age of 38. And he and his twin are buried side by side. And so the doctor never commented on his suicide, on the autobiography, anything like that. And apparently he told his colleagues that he was mortified by the case.
Jeez.
Yeah. So there's some documentaries out there. I haven't watched any of the video documentaries. Like I said, I just read the book, but there's a lot of interesting stuff out there about it. If you want to find out more, it's a pretty riveting case. And if you've taken, I don't think it comes up in Psych 101, but if you've taken some advanced psych courses or gender and sexuality courses, I'm sure it's covered in that. So this might sound a little familiar. And so the other thing that I'm going to talk about is what gender assignment surgery is now when we're talking about infants and children. And so it is something that still occurs. Sometimes it is with parental consent. Sometimes it is not, unfortunately. And so I've personally worked with a child who was born intersex. So let me back up. Intersex means that you are born with both sets of genitalia, maybe not fully formed, but you have both female and male organs or parts of both. And so typically at birth, that early on, a sexual reassignment or assignment surgery would need to be made if there's some actual medical problem with urination, bowel movements, things like that. If that part of your genitalia is so underdeveloped or undeveloped that it's causing other medical issues. So that's why they would do it immediately at birth. Other times they would wait a couple of years before making any surgical decisions. And then again, like I said, it depends on the individual child, depends on what the organs look like, how they're developing, and if there's other issues. But the particular child that I worked with, he was reassigned at birth and his mother was told after the fact. And so there was a lot of, and this was relatively recent. I would say it was in the last 10 to 15 years. Wow. And so when all the mother knew was that something was wrong with the baby, they had to do a surgery because he was having some sort of organ problems. That was all that they had told her. And so then after the fact, she was told that they had assigned her child as a boy and that he would be sterile for his whole life and he would need a lot of work moving forward, specifically to make his penis functioning for urination. So he had multiple surgeries in the first several years of life just for that, just being able to function physically in that way.
Wow.
And so by the time I was seeing him, there was a lot of stuff going on, some hyperactivity, possible ADHD, some behavioral stuff. But the big reason was his self-esteem was really, really hurting and he didn't know. And so the mother had done her best. So when I was seeing him, he was about six or seven, so still little. And so luckily the mom had been open enough to share things at his age level, but still at the age of 6, like these are big concepts that a 6-year-old may not get, but he understood that he has to have surgeries, on his bottom parts, to help keep him healthy. And that when he's a grown up, he might not ever be able to be a daddy on his own, but he could adopt a kid or things like that. So he knew those basic things at least. And he had expressed to me, this was like the sweetest child I've ever met. Like, I still think about him and wonder where he's at, and I hope he's doing okay. But he expressed to me that he didn't know who he was, that he didn't think he was like the girls in his class, but he didn't think he was like the boys in his class. And so he liked both of them. And at that point, he was pretty well developed socially. He had friends of both genders, but he always felt like, well, I'm not like them and I'm not like them, so I don't know who I'm like. And so a lot of the work that we did was just on general healthy individual development, like, what are the good things about you? What are your strengths? What things do you need help with? Do you feel comfortable asking for help? And like all of those kind of just more general things. But we definitely, his family knew that, moving forward, there need to be more psychological work done to manage just the situation that he was in.
Right.
Intersex babies occur approximately 1% to 2% of the population. And so that, I feel like it's unusual because a lot of people are still just now learning about intersex. Intersex is the I in LGBTQIA, which I know there is some debate about because it's not a choice.
Right.
And I mean, a lot of people have have thoughts about whether your gender identity, your sexual attraction is a choice. I think it's up to the individual person. You get to decide if you were born that way or if you chose that way. But I do feel like intersex is a little bit different because it does stem from a medical problem.
Right.
Or, underdevelopment. I don't want to, pathologize it, but it is stemming from something different than some of those other things stem from. And then, like I alluded to before, a lot of those folks didn't necessarily get their own autonomy in making those choices when they were little about gender assignment, surgery on their own bodies. Hopefully more people now, their parents are making educated decisions about that and can support them. So that way, when they're older and they have questions, they can have that conversation. But it does occur sometimes without parents' permission. And so there is an article with the healthlaw.org, which is a national health law program, talking about how, and this was from July 2021, so not that long ago, how surgeries on intersex infants are just not appropriate medicine, that there can be other ways to address some of the medical issues that these children are having until a true decision can be made. And so there is actually some legislation going on to end non-consensual intersex surgeries. So that's what I talked about before when you're not consulting with the family. But it's still TBD on that one. I think part of where it's coming from is because, especially around that time, but definitely now more than ever, we need to be talking about people's rights and their advocacies, especially over their own bodies. And so making sure that families and or children, if they're not too young to consent, can be a part of that decision. And then as far as the surgery for intersex, it's much like gender reassignment surgery. It's just on littler bodies. So same things where they may have to develop a penis or a vagina from other tissues. They may have to have multiple surgeries to make things functional. Or there may be reduced functionality. And then typically children who are intersex tend to be sterile just because neither of the internal organs are fully formed in order to procreate. So that is my topic. I know it was a lot of stuff. It got a little
and
cringy
intersex, the thing about it too, it's not one cause. There's multifactorial causes. So it could be a genetic cause. It could be during embryology. For some reason, two different signalings happened at the same time. And a little bit about what my topic it is actually covers some embryology. So it's not one black and white thing, and in each case is going to be actually different. There's no two that are going to be exactly the same.
And so that was something I didn't really go down the rabbit hole in because you okay?
I'm trying not to cough, and I'm not quick at hitting the mute button.
One thing I may do on another episode, because I have done some research on and gotten some exposure to really amazing information about gender reassignment in adults. And so I didn't really go into the, pardon my French, bits and pieces of what they're doing. But it can be really amazing what you can do when you're working with a specialist who works in that, and how really wonderful those folks are in making sure that the person feels the gender that they've been assigned and that everything is functional to the most of its ability. And so a lot of times, if the surgery is done correctly and appropriately and there's the appropriate follow-up and healing, you really would have a hard time telling the difference if someone had a constructed genitalia or if it was natural. And in more and more cases, as science advances, people are having having full feeling. They are having sensitivity. They are able to experience pleasure. And so it's definitely something that we've come a long way but it is not easy surgery and there's a lot of risks to it. And so I didn't find too much on those risks in babies, but
Right.
I would imagine the risks are even higher
Similar.
just because
Yeah.
certain things, just like I'm thinking, wow, I just blanked on the word. Like arteries and blood flow and
Right.
things like that. You do that wrong, someone could bleed out and die.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you want to make sure that everything is going well. And then the smaller the bodies, the harder it is to do all that.
Teeny
so we have some
tiny.
amazing specialists out there in the world that are doing great work.
Cool. That's cool.
Yeah. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
All right. So my cocktail, I am not having my cocktail today
How
because
dare
of my sickness, but
The alcohol
I will
make
try
the
it.
sickness go away.
Yeah. I don't know if I should promote that. Okay. So it's called The Teenage Dream.
Mm-hmm.
Cue music. Although what's interesting isn't Teenage Dream a Katy Perry song? Right?
It is,
Teenage
although
Dream?
California Girls was playing in my head and it's not the same as the name of the
But
song.
apparently the cocktail is an Olivia Rodrigo Guts-inspired cocktail. I don't really know the connection, but I like the name and it went with what I was doing.
I mean, no shade to Olivia, but Katie's been around longer, so...
Yeah, I don't know. So it's 50 mLs of gin, not Jim.
Jim, who's that?
15 mLs of elderflower liqueur, so like Saint Germain. 25 mLs of lemon juice, 2 drops of purple food coloring or food gel, and soda water to top. And they suggest you top it also with pink candy floss. So I guess that would be like cotton candy.
Yeah. I was going to say both of our drinks today would have been purple.
Purple, I know.
Nice.
So basically you mix everything except for the soda water in a tall glass, stir, top with the soda water, ice, and then garnish with your candy floss, as they call it.
I don't like cotton candy.
Yeah, I've never been huge. We actually have a little cotton candy maker that I got in the kids, but yeah, it's just sugar for the sake of sugars.
No, it's eating hair. That's what it is. Y'all are eating hair.
So what I'm covering is actually something called Fitting In, which is a movie. It's a 2023 Canadian coming of age comedy drama. And it was written and directed by Molly McGlynn. It stars Maddie Ziegler. She's from Dance Moms.
Yeah.
And from Sia videos. Yeah. And so it was basically a film that started on the film festival circuit. And it actually won Best Canadian Film in the Vancouver International Film Festival in 2023. And Ziegler actually won an outstanding performance by an actor in the Northern Ontario Music and Film Awards. And it actually did come out in limited release in theaters worldwide in 2024. And interestingly enough, the film's writer and director wrote this based on something that she experienced herself. And that is the syndrome that we'll talk about later. So the film centers around a 16-year-old Lindy who is basically, I'll go into more detail of the film itself, but she's diagnosed with a rare reproductive condition called MRKH, and I'll spell all of that out for you later. But that's, again, what the writer and director had, and so she was inspired to write something so that others going through this could find something to relate to, basically. So the scene opens of the movie of Maddie Ziegler in the shower, Lindy, and she cut her leg shaving. And so she quickly just gets out of the shower and she grabs one of her mom's pads, like sanitary pads, and cleans her leg with it and throws it out. Mm-hmm. Why she didn't use, toilet paper or tissue, don't know. But she does that. She throws it out.
And then at pads soak up the blood. So
Yeah. So at breakfast, her mom says, "Oh, hey, what's going on? Did you get your period?" Because she saw it in the garbage can. And she's like, no. And they don't say exactly how old she is, but about 16 probably at this point. And the mother asks if she wants to go see a gynecologist. And they do. There's a lot of sort of single mom butting heads with the teenage girl throughout this film and sort of that coming of age and learning to deal moms and daughters. Then they cut to the school. They're exercising. Lindy's a track star. You see her with her BFF. They see her flirting with this new boy. Well, not new, but this boy. And so a couple different interactions with this boy. She decides on her own that she's going to go to a gynecologist to see about getting contraception. Mm-hmm. So oral contraceptive pill. the whole experience she has at this gynecology office, it's a white, older male gynecologist. She's a young teenager. He's very gruff. It's very uncomfortable. And basically gruffly tells her, like, yeah, you have no vaginal opening. The end. Like he doesn't really offer her.
Yeah, now what do I do about this? Just
right. Like he doesn't offer her anything. And it's just very like, okay, here. He gives her prescriptions to go get an MRI and an ultrasound. And so you kind of see her going in the machine and getting those things done. And then you see her seeing another gynecologist. And the gynecologist comes in and calls in a bunch of residents, and can the residents come see? Can they come see? And you kind of see her laying on the bed and very uncomfortable, her legs in the stirrups, and she sort of makes eye contact with this female resident who happens to be close to her head, like with like fear in her eyes. So basically, they
have you ever been on that side of things? I know you've been a resident, so probably had to go into, or you had to go into rooms as training. A student, but have you ever been on the other end of it?
So I mean, I've had residents take care of me actually during my deliveries, so I've had that end of things, and I always say okay. I've not. I don't know. I haven't had a problem. I haven't had a problem with it, but I haven't had that's basically the only experience I've had with it.
Yeah, I had it when I was having heart issues, and it was just, I mean, I guess it's worse when you're having heart issues because then like your boobs are out and all these strangers are in the room, but also by that point in my heart journey, everybody had seen my boobs, so I was like, go for it. Nothing
well, hey, my everything was out because
that is true.
I was about to have a baby.
That is true. But it can be a really jarring experience, I would imagine, for anyone, but especially a young girl.
Yeah. I mean, and remember, she's a teenager. She's under 18.
And she went on her own. Like mom
right. She went on her own. Exactly. So, basically what they do is they tell her this, you have no vaginal opening. You have this thing called MRKH. You do not have a uterus. You have normal ovaries. That's why you have breasts and, secondary sexual characteristics. But you need to form a vagina using dilators, essentially. So they give her this whole big kit of dilators from really, really tiny all the way up to large. And she's supposed to insert that every night, or push pressure essentially on this barely there dimple she has down there every night for a certain period of time, and slowly progress to the larger ones.
At no point did they be like, do you want to call your mom before we explain this? Or
they do eventually tell the mom. Okay. I'm trying to remember where that comes. It comes in right here. I just these are my little jotting down notes as I was watching the movie. The mom does know at this point. Okay. Yes. I was gonna mom knows.
If your like teenage daughter comes home with essentially a big old box of dildos, you're going to be like, what the heck?
But, the whole
dilators
thing
aren't dildos, but still.
Yeah. But the whole thing, it's very, there's a whole lot more that needed to go into supporting her.
Of course.
She starts to, of course, be very angry. She's sort of grieving sort of what she doesn't have, her future in certain ways. She pushes everyone away, including this new guy that reason she went to the gynecologist to begin with is because she had this new guy that she was flirting with, and eventually they were kind of dating, and she pushes him away.
Did the mother know when she was younger, or this was like now all of this was just getting discovered?
This usually is diagnosed when somebody does not have their period by 16, because externally everything looks the same. So unless you're trying to insert anything in there, you would not know.
Okay.
So she starts pushing everybody away. One of the resources the doctor's office had given her was this meeting for LGBTQIA. And I guess they would consider this sort of in the intersex, even though it's not really. It's just the absence of certain things. It's not an ambiguous genitalia. But anyway, she goes there and kind of sits in on this meeting, and it's similar to like an AA meeting, sort of people kind of get up and speak, and they try and get her to say something, and she starts to say something. She sees somebody she recognizes there, this other person she met earlier in the movie, casually along with her best friend, and that's this person named Jax, who comes up later. And Jax, I believe, is non-binary. She's sort of struggling, railing in all directions, sort of acting out. She just doesn't know what to do with herself. She ends up going in late night to some fast food restaurant, and this young guy that works at the counter there, she kind of pegs him and sees that he appears to be unexperienced because he has a crucifix on, and she figures he's a good little church boy and he's probably never had sex before.
She's never been to a Catholic school. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you laugh and then cough.
So she takes him into the car, and basically forces him to have sex with her because he will not know that her vagina is not of normal length. And so,
so at this point, she's at least begun that process with the
right.
dilators. Okay.
And so it's certainly not very far along. And that is one option they give a person, is once they have created this vagina, to maintain it is just sexual intercourse, is
so
to
that's
continue
the prescription. Have more
to
sex.
keep it for, open.
Makes
so she starts to use this guy, essentially, meets up with him here and there, and sort of does that to, I don't know, just get everything out. She's very confused. She just doesn't know what she wants. She just wants to be a quote unquote normal girl.
Yeah.
She then later kind of runs into that Jax that she had seen at the meeting that she had met earlier. And she, of course, is a little bit confused, and she sort of ends up hooking up with Jax. She's exploring, do I want a girl? Do I want a boy? I don't know what I want. I just want somebody, I guess, to feel close to. Like, she really just doesn't know what she wants. But later she even pushes Jax away, sort of embarrassing at a party. She's just kind of all over the place. And then she's drunk at a party, and she drunkenly tells somebody about it. She's like, I don't have a vagina. Does anybody know that? Like this whole thing. And of course, the next day, everything's all over school. Texts, videos, everyone, everything. She becomes the pariah. She's, of course, bullied. She kind of comes to terms with everything and says, screw it, I'm not going to do anything about the dilators right now. Her whole life gets kind of crazy. But essentially, in the end, there is this sort of epic scene where, after everything she's been through, she sort of comes to terms with her own self, and she stands up to the bullies. Like, she gets out there and she's like, you know what? Yes, I don't have these parts, and I am who I am. And like, she makes this whole big epic speech, and sort of it is really nice at the end, the way she stands up for herself. But you saw her go through like sort of this dark time and have to fully come to terms with it herself, and then come out on the other side with sort of a new reimagination of what her life could be. And does this matter? Can she move on? So it was really well done. It was very much one of those coming of age indie films, and especially, of course, because it was written by somebody who's gone through it. So what are we talking about? MRKH. So I'm going to spell out what that is.
I was going to say, I can't even guess.
That's the only time it's named after 4 people, 4 doctors. 4 male doctors, of course.
And they don't even get their full names in it. Oh, wow.
Meyer, Rokotansky, Kuster, and Hauser.
Like Doogie.
Hauser.
Hauser.
And Kuster has the thingies over the U.
Yeah,
the 2 dots.
Umlaut.
That, yeah. I'm the one who had German. I don't know. Yeah, that.
I don't know German. I just know that's what it's called.
So that is the name of the syndrome, MRKH syndrome, otherwise known as Mullerian agenesis or Mullerian aplasia or vaginal agenesis. So the Mullerian ducts are embryologic ducts that are in, when you're forming in utero. And, those have to differentiate into different structures over time. And so there's a defect in the way that divides and becomes structures that leaves this to happen. This is found in somewhere around to 1 in 5,000 births. They don't have an exact number.
That's a lot more than I would have expected.
So, right. So, yes, but there are also varying degrees of this, and some other things can fall into this because there are other defects of the Mullerian tube that who knows if they're counting some of those. So, basically normal development of the female reproductive tract involves highly orchestrated, complex things that happen. Differentiation.
I'm laughing because I'm like, yes, our reproductive tracts are highly orchestrated, not for amateurs.
They differentiate the Mullerian ducts, something called the urogenital sinus, to form the internal female reproductive tract. They originate from different germ layers. So germ layers are layers of cells, and there's a lot going on. We're not going to get into like the nitty gritty, but basically something called the mesoderm and the endoderm are 2 different developmental lines that are interconnected in both the way they develop. And so the difference is the Mullerian ducts form the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the cervix, and the top third of the vagina, or the top 2/3 of the vagina.
Why only the top 2/3?
I assume that bottom part comes from whatever forms the vulva.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it's just the way it forms. The ovaries are completely separate.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that these, again, will have all normal growth secondary sexual characteristics because they have the hormones, they just don't have the physical structures. And this usually is all occurring about 6 weeks of development. So 6 weeks of development, both female and male embryos have 2 sets of paired genital ducts, the Mullerian and the Wolffian ducts. And they're identical at this point and visually, but cellularly, there's already some differentiations. In the female, the Wolffian ducts degenerate because there's no testosterone, and the Mullerian ducts develop, and opposite happens in the males.
I just realized something that I should have said and could have said, but I didn't, and something you didn't really discuss, the difference between primary sex organs and secondary.
Right. Well, we say, yeah, we call it secondary sexual characteristics, the development of hair, breasts.
So things that come later on versus identifiable at birth or identifiable genetically.
We always say secondary sexual characteristics. I don't know why we don't say there is no, I never say primary sexual
I thought primary was just like
just
visually,
the structures. I guess so. It just is. I never called it primary, but yes.
Yeah, that's what my understanding was, that the primary was just what you visually see from the genitalia at the bottom half. And then everything else is secondary.
Yeah. Secondary sexual characteristics is what people on the outside can see. Mm-hmm. So there is actually a little bit of a connection between the way the Mullerian ducts form and the renal urinary system. So sometimes these anomalies can be paired with renal anomalies. So something called a duplicate collecting system, which, fun fact, I have 2. So each kidney is supposed to have 1 ureter that drains into your bladder. My left one has 2. Just for fun,
just in
a little
case.
Extra. So, but that's considered a urologic, anomaly. So sometimes those can be paired with this, not always. Other just anomalies. So remember, all this formation, other things can happen. So yes, we have what we're talking about, the full-on MRKH, right? You can also have what's called a uniquarterate uterus. So what do we think that looks like? Uniquarterate.
You only have a quarter of it?
One? Yeah, and it's kind of like to the side like that. It's one half, like one side.
Oh, okay.
Uniquarterate or uterus didelphys, which is 2 uteruses.
I've heard of that.
A bicornerate uterus. So uniquarterate is 1 half. Bicornerate is where instead of it looking more round, those like 2 halves are more, it's more heart, like those are more defined.
Oh, so it goes in instead of out.
Yeah. The septate uterus, which means you could have just a line, a septum right up the middle there. And then you can have a longitudinal vaginal septum, which would be a cross, transverse, and then some complex anomalies. But
transverse means upside down?
I don't know. Transverse usually means backwards, so I'm not quite sure. Transverse vaginal septum. But, the bottom line is there's many things that can sort of go awry in development. And so the most sort of extreme circumstances is this Mullerian agenesis. And they really don't know the etiology completely. There are some genetic markers and there are some families this runs in, but then there can be plenty of people who it doesn't run in families. And of course, until the recent reproductive technology, you wouldn't have been able to directly pass this down because you don't have a uterus to carry a child. So it couldn't be direct, hereditary in that way. So typically it is diagnosed at puberty when they basically have primary amenorrhea, meaning they never got their first period by the age of 16. Usually they show normal growth on the outside, and really the outer introitus and vagina can look very normal until you try and go more than, a centimeter or so in.
What's an introitus? Just the opening?
The entrance, yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. I'd never heard it called an introitus.
That's the technical term.
Fancy.
So sounds, can show either the absence of a uterus or what they call a rudimentary uterus, which would be just sort of very underformed, very tiny one. MRI is really the best to distinguish structures in the pelvis for really all things. For female genital or genitourinary structures, MRI is really great at seeing things, and that would be able to see if there is actually a vagina. Also, of course, on exam, a doctor could take something like one of those very long Q-tips, try and see if they can go anywhere, because you could also have just an imperforate hymen, right?
That was what I was thinking when you first, were talking about the story, and when he was like, oh, well, you don't have an opening. I was like, okay, well, is that just like really
Right.
thick hymen? I know nothing
Right.
about this, so I sound probably
Right.
really stupid, but
No, this is very rare. This is something most people don't know about. Imperforate hymen would be much more common.
okay.
This is, so this is why the MRI can see that inside there is no vaginal canal.
I have a question that you may not know the answer to.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we have a hymen?
Do not know.
Because we got to break it, so what's the point?
Don't know.
Okay.
I don't think it serves any purpose. It's probably something left over from embryology that didn't finish until you get older.
Things that make you go, Listeners, give us your ideas. I can imagine the emails now. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. No, we don't want your ideas about why we have a hymen.
So basically the treatment, as we started, is the first treatment typically is dilation. Some people might not
Would
be
that
able
be
to.
painful?
It can be. Of course, again, these are teenagers. It's awkward. It's difficult to talk to them about this, but they want you to use lube to try and also make it sort of like a masturbation experience, to sort of put some pleasure in it, but doesn't really always work out that way because it's very stressful.
Yeah, it sounds very clinical.
It is. Yeah. And but that is always the primary first step, because the other steps, if that is not successful or you cannot do it or you cannot tolerate it, would be surgical.
Mm.
And the reason you would do this, you don't have to do this. You don't have to have a vagina, right?
If you want to have sex, you do.
Right. Well, if you want to have penis, vagina.
That's true. If you want to
sex.
have penetrative sexual intercourse. Sorry.
Right. So that is
right.
So that is the reason for it, but there is no medical reason you have to. So you could choose not to.
But if they don't have a vagina, then they couldn't, let alone just not getting pregnant, you wouldn't be able to carry a baby or deliver a baby, I guess.
Well, hold on. We'll get there. We're going to get there with other options.
Okay.
So that's step one. Surgery is considered the most effective, but of course risks with everything.
Yeah.
So this would be considered a vaginoplasty. So similar to what you would do in a gender reassignment, except for the difference is in a gender reassignment, you have all that scrotal tissue, if you're doing male to female, that you can use to invaginate and form a vagina, right? But you don't have that here. You have lack of tissue. You got nothing. So sometimes what they'll do is they'll take a flap of skin from your buttocks or your inner thigh, and they'll form sort of a cuff with that. Another way that they can do it is they actually can take some intestinal or rectal tissue and use that. Another thing is called a Vacchetti procedure, I believe, is the one where let me find the Vacchetti. They basically, they still do some surgery. They create a space between the bladder and the rectum where the vagina will be formed, and they put an olive, like a little metal, not know if it's metal, but a little olive-shaped dilator.
I thought you meant like an actual olive. I'm like, wait,
no,
what?
But inside, and they sort of, this is so hard, and if someone wants to really visualize this, you'll get a diagram. You won't get anything weird, but Google Vincetti procedure, and they'll pull a suture essentially up through your body to out of your abdomen, and they tighten those over time. If you think about that, and it kind of pulls the olive up, if that makes sense. You have to really see a picture. So that's one of the procedures. The ones where they use the skin flaps and things, those are called the Mackendo, and there's a couple different versions of the Mackendo. That's the more common one. Complications, of course, are going to be infection, bleeding, injury to organs, all those things. So, if you do, as we talked about, fertility, or you do want to have children. So, of course, one option would be IVF with a surrogate. You have functioning ovaries.
Yeah.
So you can do stimulation, formation of eggs, follicles, remove those, fertilize, and put into a surrogate to carry them for you. So that's one great option. Of course, adoption, which is an amazing, thing that you can do. That's another option. But there are now programs in the U.S. for uterine transplant. And so you could transplant a uterus. And there is actually, I think UPenn, near us, near Pennsylvania, New Jersey, that area has a program for uterine transplant. And so you would transplant the uterus into the woman. She would, of course, still have to take the anti-rejection drugs. She could still you would have to do IVF to fertilize and all that stuff. And then you would have to have a C-section to deliver. But that is an option to carry if you really felt strongly about carrying your own child in utero. So there are options nowadays. That's very, very new in the forefront.
Yeah, I'm wondering how often that someone's able to get that transplant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of hoops and there's a lot to go through, but there are programs throughout the United States, and that one at UPenn is or Penn Medicine. I'm sorry, I'm saying UPenn. It's Penn Medicine. That's what I meant. Is one of the ones very close by. So I did link, the movie. I linked some information about MRKH, some of the treatments, and of course the cocktail. But it's an interesting, rare thing, and I think it's also, you don't know what somebody else is going through because it's not something you're walking around just telling everybody.
Yeah.
And so it kind of gives you pause. Like, you expect that everybody has this typical puberty experience, and maybe they don't. Maybe there's something else going on there. So it's interesting. And of course, girls, moms, teenagers, that's drama to begin with. So throw something like this, like traumatic, on top of it, and it can be very difficult. But there's a lot more out there now. There's programs out there.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I was thinking of when you were just talking about that is that there's so many assumptions that people make about women and their roles and their sexuality and what that means. And so having anything like that that's getting in the way of fulfilling those traditional gender roles can be really upsetting just internally, then let alone when people start asking or being invasive or making assumptions, or it can be really tough to deal with. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is not at that extent, but absolutely, we were having trouble having children, and it was a little before people talked about fertility, and I was internalizing it. I was like, everybody expects me to do this. Everybody expects me to have, these children. People are saying, you've been married for this long. Where are they? And people, I don't think, are doing it to be mean.
Right.
People just are well-wishing, but they have, people just don't think, they just don't know, and you're internalizing it. So yeah, the whole female expectation.
Yeah, well, I have like almost the opposite. Like, as you know, I don't have any children, and I've had like a lot of people, especially patients, who I think they do it in a way to kind of connect on an additional level. But they're like, oh, well, you have kids, right? Or you understand as a mom. And I'm like, I can understand what you're telling me. Yes.
Right.
And then it's like this whole awkward thing. And luckily it doesn't happen that often, but every once in a while I've had patients they're like, oh, well, how would you know? You don't have kids. Sometimes it's for the better, because then I can kind of take that emotional piece out of it
and step back
and look at it. Yeah.
I even tell my own children, I say, if you want to have children, if you want to get married, there is not an expectation here. If what makes you happy is having a career or traveling the world or whatever, there's a lot of crazy stuff.
Yeah, as we've seen, like, there are lots and lots of women who want to have babies and can't, or want to be mothers and don't have the means to adopt or other things. So it's like these gender roles that we're placed in, they can affect people on so many levels, and people just make assumptions like, oh, well, you just don't want to, or you're being selfish.
I don't know about that.
And I think, like you were saying, it's a lot of old school thought. Luckily, I think we're progressing in the right direction on that, but it still comes up for people. I think it's more of like a family thing, like when you meet with family members, like, oh, when you're having kids, or when is this happening, or when is that happening? It's like, can we talk about something else? There are other things to talk about.
I know. All right. So that was pretty interesting. Definitely some topics way out there. And I think this is something our listeners, both topics, they really wouldn't know much about. So I think this was definitely unique.
Yeah. And this time when I mentioned, oh, I'll talk about this in another episode, I actually wrote it down because I haven't been doing that so far. So I'm sorry if I said I was going to cover something in a future episode and didn't. I forgot. I'll have to go back and re-listen. But this is on the list. The things I talked about covering in the future are on my list. And
nice.
We are always looking for other ideas, feedback, somebody to cheer us on. So shoot us emails at medicalmediamixer@gmail.com.
Also, we are running our Instagram contest because this episode comes out in April. So I've been posting it on our Instagram page. Go on, snap a picture and post it of yourself listening, or just your screen listening to an episode of Medical Media Mixer, and put I'm listening to hashtag Medical Media Mixer in, and whatever state, country you're listening to it in. Each of those times that you use the hashtag Medical Media Mixer, you'll be entered into a raffle to win a cool prize, which I announced in the last episode, is this cool sort of infusion kit that you can make a cocktail or a mocktail with.
Yeah.
Follow us on all our socials. Yeah, follow us on our socials. Rate, review, subscribe.
Follow, whatever it's called.
Do all the things. Tell a friend. Actually, that really counts more than anything. Yeah. Because from what I hear in the algorithms, all the reviews don't necessarily push you up on, Apple or Spotify or whatever. It's literally just word of mouth, people, numbers. So get out there, tell a friend.
Yeah. Tell a friend, tell your coworker, tell people at the bar, tell people in the hair salon, tell whoever you think might like listening to a new podcast. But you can still rate us because so far we have 5 stars and that feels really great. I don't know if
It
we
is.
necessarily deserve all 5 stars for every episode, but I love that we're getting love from some
Yeah.
people out there. So keep that up too.
And I'll see you this weekend at the high school Tricky Try and
Yes.
the medical media mixer basket. So whoever wins that, I sure hope that they're now a listener.
Yeah.
And shout out to them.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to try and grab your name so we can give you a formal shout out on the next episode that we tape.
We're going to be those crazy people running through the Tricky Try like, wait, hi, that's our basket. What's your name?
I know. Well, oh my gosh, I forgot to tell you, I got us cowbells to ring
Oh
from
my
our table
God.
wins, and I got a screaming goat button, but I cannot for the life of me unscrew the screw in the back to put batteries in, so we may not have a screaming goat.
Well, you need a better screwdriver.
I tried literally 4 different screwdrivers. I don't know.
Oh.
It's defective, I guess.
We're going to be those obnoxious people, though.
We always are those obnoxious people that everyone
Let's
truly
not
loves.
get in fights. Shout out to
No.
your friend Daniel.
She listens, so she'll hear that.
I know.
Yes.
No beating anybody up at the Tricky Try.
No fights, all love, all the prizes. My TV broke last night, so I need to win a TV.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
Let's go for it. Big money, big money.
Yeah. Well,
All
I think
right.
that's all that we've got to say for today. So,
It is. Thank you for listening to Medical Media Mixer.
the perfect cocktail. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.